Hey folks, welcome to Lawfare Live. No, this is not an episode of Trump's Trials and Tribulations. We wrapped up that series last week. Lawfare Live, however, continues. We will be here on a regular basis as often as possible in this Thursday time frame, the time roughly the same time that we were doing Trials and Tribulations. Uh, Today we are talking Syria. And we are talking Syria with a remarkable group of people with remarkably diverse expertise on the subject. From the Middle East Institute, Charles Lister, who you will have heard on the Lawfare podcast talking about these issues with Dan Byman a week and a half ago or so. Ammar Abdulhamid, who is a longtime pro-democracy activist from Damascus, more recently the Washington area, and of course my colleague Scott Anderson of Lawfare, who, you think he's the guy who knows about foreign relations law, but which he is, of course. But what you forget about foreign relations law is when a government collapses and you have a bunch of warring parties in a state, who gets recognized and under what circumstances as the government. That's called foreign relations law, and we happen to have an in-house expert on that and sanctions stuff. So we've got a remarkable diversity of expertise here, and without more, let's get into it. So, Charles, get us started. Uh, Give us a sense of what the last week and a half has been, or the last week, and where we are now.
Gosh, okay, so to start with the easy bit, I mean, just dramatic change in a rapid amount of time. We've gone from being in a state of so-called frozen conflict in Syria, where at least the territorial lines weren't changing and hadn't changed for about 4.5 years, to all of a sudden the entire regime collapsing in the space of about a week, right from Aleppo in the north to Damascus in the south. So everything's changed. So Bashar is gone, and all of the questions now are what's the new chapter of Syria going to look like? Who's running the show? I think there's plenty to be said about that right now, but what does Syria's new government that's been slated to be created in March 2025. What is that going to look like? How does the international community play a role in trying to guide the formation of that entity? But right now, and Ammar can speak more to this than I can, but Syrians, I think, almost uniformly are kind of euphoric, relieved, breathing free air for the first time in nearly 54 years. I think, has to be sort of noted just how tyrannical the Assad family's rule has been for much of that multiple decade time frame. And so for Syrians, this is a completely new experience of freedom. And I think there's a great deal of excitement about forming a new state and a new nation and reuniting the country and rebuilding and all of those exciting things. But at the same time, a great deal of sort of trepidation as well about how we get there and what that future looks like, and avoiding some of the mistakes that were made in the past, where we had just a surge of external countries trying to get involved and actually ending up, I think, doing more worse or more bad than good. And we are at a risk of potentially being in that place right now with a huge surge of external players trying to get involved. But all things considered, a very hopeful moment. Thank God.
All right, so Ammar, pick it up from there. We uh, have a country where the government that just fell did not control all that much of the country, although it was a substantial block. Different parts of the country are under the control of factions and of different ethnicities, ideologies, religious persuasions. What do we know about who is in charge in Syria right now? And uh, do we even understand that picture in a real sort of way?
I think we have a good understanding, to be honest with you, because over the last few years, people like Charles and others have been really doing a great job mapping up the different groups that are operating in Syria. Now, we do have, other than the Kurds, the other actors are really all various shades of Islamism. So when you ask about the future, where are we going? Well, it seems logical to say, and since the people who have guns on the ground and are in control, all are very shades of Islamism, are really, we're going to have some form of Islamist government emerging. The question is what, to which degree, how pragmatic it will be in its relation with with the Syrian people, with the different regions. Will they accommodate the reality that the fact that they have a gun does not mean that they will be considered, that their Islamist point of view is going to be embraced by everyone? They seem to have that kind of understanding. They seem to realize that not everyone is going to run and embrace their version of Islamism or Islamism at all. So they are being pragmatic right now, but the question is for how long? I mean, after the euphoria and is over, and I think the downfall of Assad was a necessary milestone, because you would never have been able to do anything about our challenges with him around. But now we have to confront these challenges: the fragmentation of the country, the need for reconciliation, and the need to find a way for dealing with Islamism. It's not going to be easy. I mean, none of this is going to be easy in any way, and things might get worse before they get better, and we might be talking about a new form of generational struggle here. So we have to accept that this is indeed the possibility on the table. Those who are interested in moderation or secularism on the part of the opposition need to get their act together soon, in order to use this moment of transition to try to have some of their concerns addressed. If they miss the ball on that one, we are definitely going to have more of a hardline Islamist movement. And despite the fact that the people are hoping that Turkey will be a moderate in influence, that the need for foreign investment and legitimation will sort of moderate the ideology of the or the behavior of the current leaders in Damascus. But we cannot take that for granted. The reality is people can be irrational about these things. And so unless there is a concerted effort that were on part of the Syrian opposition, unless there is an outreach to the international community to help lay down a roadmap for transition and to be part of that conversation, we might be going towards a very difficult period, even probably more difficult than the last few years.
And so when you look at this situation going forward, so a lot of people, including you, over the last week have said to me, I'm joyous, I'm euphoric, but I'm also trepidatious, and there's a lot of ways that this could turn very bad. And although it's hard to imagine it being worse than the Assad regime, but I suppose it's theoretically possible. When you look a year out and you say, a year out, if we're not expecting, Madisonian democracy, what is the benchmark, as you think about it, of a successful beginning of a transition? What does it look like if what that you would say a year after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, wow, things have gone really well. We're not there yet. We're not where I want to be, but the transition has been everything I could have asked for.
If in cities like Damascus and Aleppo and all the main cities in Syria, women can still walk around without having to cover up or being told to cover up, then that's a good benchmark. If different communities and different towns like Harde or Salamieh, which are majority Christian, majority Ismailite, and there will be majority Kurdish areas as well, if they are allowed to sort of run their own affair with minimal interference from the central authority, then that's a good measure also to take. If the school curricula did not all become Islamist and 50% of the education is devoted to the Hadith and the Quran and the sort of Western tropes and anti-Semitic trope, then that will also be a good benchmark. So basically, it's women's rights, minority rights, and individual liberties, and education. These are benchmarks that I think will make sense to a lot of Syrians. And if in a year we'll look at these things and we'll say, okay, we can live with that, this is not bad, then I think we have something to make us hopeful. But for now, we have to put the euphoria aside, and we'll have to realize that we have a lot of work to do in order to make this happen, in order to meet these benchmarks.
So, Charles, what are your benchmarks as you think about it's a cacophonous situation with a million threads? And when I said, what's the state of things? You said, oh my God, right? Like, I don't know where to start. So like now it's a year out. What does the situation have to look for you to say, okay, out of that cacophony came some progress?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I'd say this is almost the hardest question to ask because there are so many moving pieces. There are so many different constituent actors to take into consideration, and there's so many obstacles to jump over to get to a 12-month point where things haven't devolved into great instability. So I would agree with everything that Ammar said. I think all of the kind of rights and representative objectives that he laid out are all absolutely right and should be the goals politically and socially for Syria. I think for me, my mind is paying more attention to, I mean, as much as those, of course, are the priorities. Ultimately, my concerns are more to the obstacles and getting past those obstacles or preventing them, and most of those are more kind of military and security on the ground. For starters, the armed groups that are present in the south of Syria, who spent the past 5 years under the Russian payroll, have all flipped, and actually it was them that ended up taking Damascus initially, and are now back presenting themselves as, green flag revolutionaries. Their leader, Ahmad al-Awda, is a very different personality to Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the HTS leader, who wants to be called by his real name now, Ahmad al-Shara.
And just walk us through at a high level what the difference, like what makes them different from one another.
Well, I mean, for starters, on a very simple level, Julani or Ahmad al-Shara is the head of what remains a designated terrorist organization. His roots lie in, at best, very conservative Islamism. He has gone through, this is a bigger discussion, he has gone through, I think, quite the personal transformation. And I do think a lot of it is genuine, in large part because I've known many other Syrians of his generation who've had the same experience, going from kind of the global jihad and then returning as Syrian citizens to fight for their homeland. And it has had somewhat of a moderating effect on that more global side of the agenda. So I do think that's genuine. But Ahmad al-Awda in the south, much more on the nationalist bent. You could typically probably say a little bit more Ba'athist in his kind of orientation and the way he operates. And to be frank, also, he has become known as quite willing to put up with a lot of organized crime and a lot of much more complicated regime-like behaviors in the south. And he has intermixed himself into that dynamic over the last 5 years. So they present very sort of different visions and very different behavioral, optics. That's one big stumbling block. The other one is getting over the SDF challenge in the northeast. How do you roll in Syrian Democratic Forces that, technically speaking, still seeks some form of semi-autonomy for certainly the Kurdish region of the northeast of the country, into a Syria where HTS and all of these other actors want a fully unified Syria. And they've made that very clear. And of course, then in the mix, we have Turkish proxy factions known as the Syrian National Army that have become a really big problem over the last few weeks, whereas everyone else in Syria seems to be pointing towards de-escalation and calm and dialogue and communication. The SNA, as it's known, has done nothing except launch hostilities against the SDF. So we're in this strange place where HTS, despite all of its complications, has maintained a very effective and constructive line of dialogue with the SDF. They've agreed that neither of them will turn their guns on each other, and they're pursuing some kind of a solution. The SDF have plans either today or tomorrow to send a delegation to Damascus to meet with HTS. That's all quite well and good and very encouraging. But actually, ironically, the more kind of nationalist, element in the Syrian National Army is the big problem. And there's sort of major conflict going on in the northeast.
And is that, I'm not sure whether this is better directed to you, Charles, or to Ammar, but whichever of you feels qualified to answer it, jump in. Is that because the Syrian National Army is effectively a group of mercenaries who represent Turkey, or is it for some ideological reason?
It is. I mean, we both nodded because yes, that's basically the SNA was created by the Turkish Military and Intelligence Service with the explicit and only objective as to fight the SDF and to fight the Kurds. And they are essentially mercenaries. Or at least they have become that way. Their only kind of credibility and legitimacy is because they remain on the Turkish payroll, and that is to do this job. So pulling them away from that and maintaining some form of credibility and legitimacy is going to be an enormous challenge for Turkey. And the line of hostility between the SDF and the SNA is deep and bitter, as we're seeing play out right now.
And because I think we've seen them fight for several years now, and the SDF has taken over Kurdish territory, and the Kurds have sort of retaliated by mounting terrorist operations within these territories. I think the enmity became personal in a sense. So they might have been acting as proxies for Turkey, but there is now a personal element and vendettas involved, and feelings of we are Arabs, they're Kurds, and all of that became part of the mix as well. But what sort of gives me a little bit of guarded optimism is HTS role, and is the fact that also SDF has shown signs of pragmatism in its dealing with HTS. Now, they are now going to raise the green flag of the revolution in their territories in order to send a message that they don't want to have any separatist tendencies, and they are going to be part of the new Syria. But of course, they're doing that with the hope of maintaining as much control as possible over the areas they're currently controlling. However, we also have to note that some of these areas, like the city of Raqqa, have been traditionally majority Arab, and they really don't want to see the SDF. So there's going to be some discussion on exactly how much territory the SDF will be allowed to control, whether it's the HTS put in these rules or the SNA. And I think the HTS will try to be sort of like now an intermediary in a fight between the SNA and SDF. So it's a complex dynamic, and we don't know how will it evolve in the next few weeks. But if some form of agreement is going to be reached, it's going to save the country a lot of bloodshed that's really unnecessary at this stage, and I'm sort of rooting for it, regardless of my concerns about the other issues. This is something that we don't need. We don't need that kind of conflict anymore.
All right, so Scott, with that as a background that offers a suggestion of just how complicated this dynamic is, you're back in your old State Department office, and two questions have crossed your desk for legal advice. One is, should we desanction or delist as terrorist organizations groups that are now functionally at least part of the transitional government in Syria? Number two, what is Syria right now? It has an embassy in Washington, but it's empty. And who is the Syrian government from the point of view of the United States, and how do we think about that?
There are two really important questions. Let me take the last one first. I think it's a little briefer to answer before we dip into the sanctions question, which is admittedly the more immediate one. I mean, for the immediate future, it seems likely that the United States and most of the international community is going to see Syria as a state, something they recognize it's a cohesive entity with legal rights, with treaty obligations, that can own property overseas, including embassies, diplomatic properties, but that does not have an associated recognized government able to speak for it and exercise its legal rights. What that often means in practice is that there's no one to send diplomatic emissaries that are officially recognized, at least officially have the privileges and immunities that come with diplomatic status, although there may be unofficial emissaries coming from rebel groups or other particular foreigners. If there are assets of the Syrian state, they are likely to be more or less frozen in place de facto, if not de jure by a sanctions regime or something similar, because there will be no one recognized by the government government holding those assets overseas that has the authority to operate on Syria's behalf to maneuver them. Essentially, it's like a corporation that still exists as a corporation, but for the moment, it's not clear who the head of that corporation is, who is the CEO, the board, and therefore who can exercise all its legal rights on its behalf. This is a state that can persist for a long time. We've seen Afghanistan persist in this regard now for several years, and it's not 100% clear that that's coming to a close anytime soon. There are moments where we see states and even the international community recognize different entities on the ground acting as what are called de facto governments, often in this case, local or limited de facto governments, meaning they're serving governmental functions and roles in situations where no one else can do it and they're seen as necessary. And sometimes those actors are allowed to do things on behalf of the state as if they were its government. So sometimes those regimes or actors are allowed to have access to certain state resources, or sometimes they will enter into agreements or commitments that are treated as binding by other foreign states on the state of Syria or whatever state we're talking about after the fact. But it's kind of, it's an unusual practice. It doesn't come up that often, although it's become more common the last few decades. And it pushes things in an uncomfortable zone. Nobody is going to have the full authority to speak on behalf of Syria as a state until it has a recognized government. And it's only going to get a recognized government at a point where some political entity, whether one of the current groups or some organization set up by them, can credibly speak to having the ability to govern with some degree of consent or some degree of stability the majority of Syrian territory. And that's a high bar to reach compared to the current status quo. So I don't suspect we're going to see a fully recognized Syrian government anytime soon. Although certainly if the HTS-led sovereignty government and the SDF faction in the east come together, they would control a huge portion of Syrian territory. Maybe that would be enough to push the international community towards something closer to fuller recognition. And then they would deal with, the Turkish SNA-held areas and other areas separately. The sanctions question is kind of separate but related, because Syria is just about one of the most sanctioned territories and countries in the world. It has a huge nest of sanctions on it, many from the United States, but not exclusively. The most immediate one people are talking about, which I think is worth drilling in on, is the HTS's designation as a terrorist organization. HTS is designated as a terrorist organization by the United Nations under the 1267 regime set up by UNSCR 1267 that applies to al-Qaeda affiliates, essentially. It has been for a very long time. It's not easy to get off that list necessarily, and it's not clear it doesn't qualify for the criterion of the list currently, although that could change down the road. And then individual member states are supposed to implement that through their domestic laws and their own bilateral sanctions. The United States does that through a regime that's called the Specially Designated Globalist Terrorist, or SDGT regime, on which HTS and several of its leaders, including al-Jawlani, also appear. In addition, HTS has been designated by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. That's an FTO designation that's a little more famous. It basically does the same thing in regards to sanctions, but it brings with it the added complication that anyone who gives material support to a designated FTO is vulnerable to prosecution for material support for terrorism in the United States. Now, for the sanctions regimes, for the SDGT regimes, for a lot of the limitations that come from sanctions limitations imposed on FTOs and SDGTs, the Treasury Department and the State Department have a deal of leeway in installing different types of licenses that permit otherwise prohibited behavior. And we've seen them use that, I think, wisely, very aggressively in the context of Yemen, Afghanistan, and other jurisdictions that fall substantially under the control of designated entities. So there is something called General License 20 in regard to Afghanistan, for example, that basically says, hey, anytime you need to do anything that looks like the sort of thing you would do with a government, with the Taliban, you can do it. Yes, we know the Taliban is a designated terrorist group, but you're not prohibited from doing this. In theory, this really opens the doors to humanitarian assistance, importantly, and also all sorts of conventional economic activity that you really want to happen in these territories if you want to avoid a humanitarian economic crisis or catastrophe. The problem is that those exceptions are sometimes hard to communicate to the private actors that are relying on them. When the more complex the regime is, the more corporations and humanitarian organizations will simply say, too complicated, too risky, back off, we're not going to involve ourselves. So there's this constant effort to say, how do we communicate this to the private actors we want to come into this territory confident that they can do lots of things they normally would, like in any foreign country. They just can't, sell things directly to the Taliban for the Taliban's sake, or tell things directly to the HTS for HTS's sake. The exception to the license authority is the FTO criminal prosecution element, the material support for terrorism. There's actually no way to kind of license somebody out of material support for terrorism. If I give material support to a designated FTO, I can be vulnerable to prosecution for that, even if what I'm doing is permitted by a license. That's just the way this Congress chose to write the statutes. It's been a consistent and persistent problem for decades now, in exactly this sort of scenario. And there's no easy way around it. The Justice Department can say, we're going to exercise prosecutorial discretion. We're not going to prosecute you. Please do this. And they have done that in the past, sometimes a little begrudgingly, but they have. Problem is, governments change, attorney generals change, governments change their minds. We don't know if the Biden administration made those commitments, whether the Trump administration will abide by them, and those commitments won't hold up in court to protect you from criminal prosecution. On top of that, Congress has also installed a law that says essentially if you commit material support for terrorism as a criminal act, it can expose you to massive civil liability if you are somehow tied back to any sort of attack that hurts or injures a U.S. national and meets a few other criterion. That can be really crippling to humanitarian organizations. It provides for, among other things, treble damages. We're talking about tens of millions, billions of dollars in damages at different points. That scares a lot of actors away. FTO designation is probably a barrier and is a problem. It is something the Biden administration or the Trump administration can remove if they choose to. It's often controversial when they do so, but we've seen it done recently. Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, as I know of, in Yemen, was designated in the last week or two of the Trump administration and de-designated 2 months later by the Biden administration. So it can happen, but that's the real clear statutory barrier, the hardest one to work around. Other items, the challenge is going to be for the United States and a lot of its international allies and the United Nations, which has similar exceptions in its own sanctions, carving out and striking the right balance with licenses to say, here's the scope of permitted conduct that we want you to do in these territories under these groups' governance, but here's what you still can't do. That's too close to supporting them as a terrorist organization. And it's both carving those lines and then enforcing them and communicating them effectively. Because if you don't communicate them effectively, you're going to end up chilling a lot of the behavior you really want private actors to go do in these territories.
So before I ask Charles and Ammar to try to apply some of this, I want to focus in on one aspect of what you just said, which is that we're about to have a change of administration, and it's very hard for one administration to bind the next. But in a normal transition environment, normally the administrations would be talking to each other, right? And you would have some coordination. We're planning to delist HTS. Let's work together on, you'd have joint memos, you'd have all kinds of contacts. My impression is that exactly zero of that is happening right now. Do you have a different impression, or should we assume that there is a Biden administration and there is a Trump administration and there will be no or almost no coordination transition-wise between the two on an issue like this?
It's a very good question, and I don't think I have clear visibility to 100% confidence with what's happening. I do know that we now have an agreement between the Trump transition team and the Biden administration that's required by law to allow and facilitate essentially the landing teams that incoming administrations often send to agencies. Those create the points of contact for transition and discussion. So the barriers to those have been cleared away, and we know there are agency-specific transition teams and transition heads in place. How much conversation they're happening, how much of it is happening at a meaningful level, and frankly, how much influence those transition teams have on the incoming Trump administration's policy, I think is a big open question. Trump administration's foreign policy making around Syria in particular, among other issues, was a little unpredictable and often very influenced by individual figures' perspectives in the White House, including President Trump. That might be the case again here. We don't really know. My suspicion is that this issue is not yet on the radar. The Trump administration is making decisions about it. The Biden administration probably is cognizant of the fact that it's not useful for it to get ahead of the Trump administration. And everything's kind of in a holding pattern until we see some transition, unless they can really, force some big items across and get consensus on it. So maybe FTO de-designation could be one of those. But I doubt it. That one is just going to be too politically charged. Any FTO de-designation is going to be politically controversial. I suspect big parts of President Trump's own party are going to have a real problem with it. And so that seems like an unlikely, while that might be a desirable target for coordination, a big useful thing you could do if you could get agreement on it, I think the politics probably aren't lining up in the near term.
All right. So Ammar and then Charles. Your lawyer has just advised you of this of
Nobody
this.
likes the lawyer. It's okay.
I
I don't
mean,
take
look,
it personally.
look, these are the constraints, right? Um, how, what do you think, if you're either advising one or more of the Syrian factions, or trying to imagine how to put together a transitional process in Syria? How do you navigate that sanctions and recognitions environment in a fashion that is constructive?
There is something that Al-Jolani or Ahmad al-Shara has said in his recent CNN interview, or hinted at, is that HTS might dissolve itself. And the question is, if they dissolved itself and they became simply the members, the various transitional ministers right now simply became employees of the state and members of the new government to be established.
And what happens to the militia in that situation?
The militias become the national army, probably with other parts. So under the new government to be established, we are told by the end of March, because the transition period that have been stated is 3 months. So let's imagine by the end of these 3 months, no more HTS. The militias become the standing army. They go to usual army barracks, and whatever other groups will join them as part of the standing army. And now they're just the government. Will that change the situation?
It might, on the sanctions context. What you would be looking for as the intelligence analysts, foreign policy analysts, and lawyers that would end up looking at this in the sanctions context would be to say, how much of a genuine shift in command structure is this? We know, particularly in the Syria context, more than any other, a lot of these designated entities change names, change lineages, change forms, and have constantly over the last 10 or 15 years. The core element they've often looked at to say is like, well, how much of this is a superficial change versus a real change? Are you actually disrupting the command structure, or are the same people in charge doing the same things and just overlaying themselves with the veneer of a government? Now, look, if the United States government wants there to be a dissolution of the HTS and wants to believe that, whether it's true or not, they may be inclined to believe that, and then may give them a hook to get out from under it. Or you might see a very genuine transition where a lot of these people genuinely do change their command structure, begin to act in a manner that layers more appropriately on top of, Syrian political institutions, either present or coming in the future. And maybe they can say in good faith, yeah, actually, this isn't HTS anymore. It's worth noting a lot of people in HTS are designated themselves as well, but maybe you can work around that as well. Also, they wouldn't be FTO designated, they would just be SDGT designated, and that is a regime that's easier to manage with licenses and other sorts of exceptions.
Charles, what do you think? Is when you hear Scott describe the regime, does it make you want to pull your hair out and say this is going to make it so much harder to contemplate a transition, or does this sound navigable to you?
I mean, a bit of both. I do have, much wider part of the conversation, then I'll zoom back into HTS. But I mean, there is a large extent to which the terrorism designation authorities and the use of them has become something that, will emplace it, and very rarely is it ever removed. I mean, the whole point of sanctions in general should be to encourage or dissuade bad behavior and encourage better behavior, and thus then have an off-ramp. So the whole idea that getting off a list is just so extraordinarily hard, and it's only hard and even feasible if a government even decides that it wants to be bothered to try to take someone off the list, sort of, isn't really, it isn't how we should have designed the system from the get-go. The frustrating thing here is, first of all, I don't think we should be removing the designation swiftly. I think we should use this as leverage to encourage the kind of behaviors that we want, and that's our real leverage here. But with that being said, the frustrating thing as someone who's worked this issue, and specifically this group, all the way going back to their very first days in late 2011, is that they have changed enormously over the last 8 years. When they announced the breaking of ties with al-Qaeda in 2016, a lot of people didn't believe it. But if those people had then paid attention to how this group has behaved, acted, engaged externally since, if you plucked all of the designations off of this group and then created Earth 2.0 and then put them in that planet, we wouldn't be designating this group a terrorist organization today. We just wouldn't. For the last 4 years, they've had a constant track of engagement with the Christian and the Druze communities in northwestern Syria. They've spent their own funds, rebuilding churches, bringing bishops and clerics back into Christian villages in Idlib. They have had, although not undeclared, a constant track of engagement with the E3 countries. And there have been messages exchanged indirectly between the US government and HTS over the last 5 or 6 years. So it's not that they've had no communication. We just haven't had a reason to reconsider the designation because we've got lots of other things to worry about and not, considering whether a group has changed or not. So,
and is that the reason, or is the reason that al-Jawlani has US blood on his hands and we don't forget that kind of thing easily, and there's not really a good track record of former al-Qaeda elements becoming constructive players, so why would we revisit it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, yeah, there's troubling history in terms of, his youth and what he did when he was, in his 20s, for sure. And I think there's also an extent to which, yes, in general, once a jihadi, always a jihadi is kind of the mindset that many view this through that lens. But the other dynamic I was going to throw in here is, if we take this approach, which I think we will, and especially with an incoming Trump administration, that this is just not something that we're going to race ahead to change, we are soon going to probably find ourselves alone on that island. The UK, France, Germany are all immediately looking into removing existing designations or treating the organization as if it wasn't designated. So is the UN. I know that from the horse's mouth over the last few days. And as I forget if I said this on this call or the one I just got off beforehand, but in the last 48 hours, senior officials from, let's see if I can list them all, from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, Jordan, Turkey, Qatar, Italy, the Czech Republic, and the Norwegians and the Swedes have all had in-person meetings with HTS at the highest levels in Damascus. And the Arab states have started issuing public statements saying that they look forward to working together to rebuild Syria. So there is this kind of track which is moving at 100 miles an hour that is essentially going to make the designation a meaningless thing. And then last thing before you give the floor to Ammar, who I think wants to say something, is we have had this designation over the last few years. Fine. But throughout those last 4 or 5 years, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, Ahmed al-Shara, has been walking around Idlib, opening shopping malls, opening up new highways, visiting churches, meeting in the fields with farmers and what have you, whilst US drones have been flying in the skies of Idlib, and he's never been targeted once. So if that $10 million award on his head as a specially designated terrorist was a truly meaningful thing in terms of US policy, he'd been killed years ago. But clearly there was a decision made within the intelligence community, I assume, is that it's better that he's alive than he's dead. So doesn't that also raise some questions around, the genuine practical value of the designation being in place, if that's how we've acted?
Ammar.
Actually, let me just start right at the last point he made. US did not target al-Jawlani before, and I hope no one targets him now. I mean, can you imagine what will happen if he was assassinated at this stage? I mean, there is no other tough man around that will be able to gather and sort of convince people of his leadership at this stage. So the country will be in chaos. So in a sense, right now, if you really care about Syria, we have to join in prayer so that al-Jawlani survive regardless of his ideological leaning at this stage. This is a very strange position to be in, of course, as a Syrian, but that's the reality of the matter, is that this man right now is the linchpin to a possible stable transition towards something hopefully will be better for Syrians, and we do not want to see him disappear from the scene. And I want to just emphasize something Charles said, that indeed the designations are only significant when you care about the law but oftentimes interest trumps everything else. And at this stage, it seems to be that a lot of countries are looking at the transition in Syria and looking at the reality that's emerging as something that they can work with. And for this reason, I anticipate that there will be a relief in terms of sanctions, and we are going to see this kind of diplomatic overtures transform into some kind of aid. But I'm hoping, which is again building on something Charles said, that we will not rush, because this is a leverage we have. And for whatever it's worth, it's not going to last forever, though. We need to use it now. It's unfortunate that we are doing it in this period of transition, because there is not a lot that's left that Biden can do, but there is something that they can do. And then I don't know how much interested the Trump administration will be in their first few months, but we really need them to be interested. We need Marco Rubio. It's a good thing that he's a friend of Syria. So we need to approach him, because we need him to sort of build on whatever Blinken is doing right now, and push and forge forward with a policy on Syria, because these are very crucial months. If we can get any kind of, if you have any kind of leverage, it's now. And we really need to get in the new government that's being formed, in what's going to come after the transitional government, we need to get some conditions respected, some concessions, some pragmatic compromises from the current leaders in Damascus.
Scott.
Yeah, one point just to add on, which I agree with everything Charles and Ammar have said, and it is worth bearing in mind, I think in a really problematic way, the U.S. government, big elements of it, do approach these terrorism designations as a law enforcement question, not a policy question. They treat them as if they're non-discretionary. That's not the way the laws are designed to be applied, frankly, or were designed by Congress or by whatever administration implemented them for executive order-based regimes. One thing to bear in mind here that I do think is worth drilling home, and I really think it's emphasizing that this is not a binary, because the legal authorities that are most problematic are tied to just one US-based terrorism regime, whereas the others are much more malleable. It's entirely possible that HTS can remain a designated terrorist organization, but we can still manage and walk back a lot of the consequences of that are most detrimental politically, economically, and from a humanitarian perspective through licenses, the way we've done with the Taliban for the last 3.5 years. Not a brilliant success story by any stretch of the imagination, but there are a few legal barriers to doing a lot of the most important work that's happening there in Afghanistan. And particularly agencies have gotten a lot better in the United States and at an international level about communicating that to humanitarian organizations, private sector actors. The FTO designation is the only one that brings the harder question, because it's not as easy to kind of wave away. And that's one that's not even a hard limit. It's a question of the risk tolerance. A lot of companies aren't going to care, particularly they don't have ties to the United States. Major organizations, international organizations with substantial operations in the United States rely on U.S. funding, they will care. And they're the ones who are worried about it, because if they are exposed to U.S. courts, they could be civilly liable or criminally liable. So if you want those actors to get in, then FTO designation becomes a bigger barrier. Otherwise, though, HTS can stay a terrorist organization. It can stay UN designated and US designated if that's important to people. And that might be a good moderate point to say, they're still a terrorist organization. We're not letting them off the hook entirely, but we're going to start permitting the sorts of behavior that's important to have a functional post-Assad Syria. And I'm hoping that that middle ground that we've seen emerge in a couple of other contexts could emerge here as well, with enough bipartisan support to cross both administrations.
And just to foot stomp this point, there is a model for it, and it's that, and that's Lebanon, which is not a model for many things, but there is a government of Lebanon that the U.S. has relationships with and does business with. And one of the major factions in that government is Hezbollah, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization. So this is something that when we have reason to deal with, to navigate it, we do know how to do it, although it can be rocky. All right, there are a lot of external actors that have a voice in this conversation. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but I do want to focus on three. And let's start with, we've mentioned Turkey before. Charles, how big a voice in the internal Syrian conversation is Turkey going to have? And what are its big cards to play, some of which you've alluded to already, over the next few months as this transition begins?
So it's an important question, because I think we're starting to see some of that play out now. Abu Muhammad al-Julani was just driving the Turkish intelligence chief around Damascus in a I think blacked out Mercedes whilst dressed in a suit. So I think we're starting to see the relationship actually in a sort of ironic way. We're seeing the relationship improve. The HTS Turkey relationship has been a challenging relationship for a long while. Speaking of designations, HTS is a designated terrorist organization by Turkish law as well, which is why the relationship that there does exist between those two actors has always been through Turkish intelligence, their MIT, their intelligence organization, and not through the foreign ministry or the military. So the relationship has long been very complicated, at times very strained. All of my sources on the ground in the armed groups to point to me towards the fact that Turkey didn't actually support the launching of this offensive, but was quite quick to jump onto it once it took Aleppo and was sweeping south. And I think for that reason, the Turks are going to push very hard to, essentially ride the horse that has marched into Damascus. And I think, as I said, we're seeing that start to play out. I think Turkey has the real advantage as well, because by and large, it is one of the very few countries that basically stood by the opposition all of these years. I think to a large extent, actually, Qatar might actually have even more of an advantage. Qatar really did stand by the opposition. It never considered normalizing ties with Assad in a way that, frankly speaking, Turkey was over the last few months before all of this happened. And interestingly so, the Turkish intelligence delegation that took to Damascus today was accompanied by Qatari intelligence chief as well. And so Qatar's about to reopen their embassy, as are Turkey. And I think it will be those two countries in partnership that will probably both run and coordinate all the dialogue that goes through HTS over the coming months. As the transition starts to take shape, they will certainly be, I think, particularly the Qataris, our American channel. When I say our, ignore my British accent, I am American. So the Qataris, I think, will become our primary channel of communication through to the kind of de facto authority that's taking shape in Damascus. So those two together, I would say, are going to be playing the major role. But then, of course, Turkey also has a role to play in the north. And the issues that we were talking about earlier, and the escalation between the SNA and the SDF. That is something that bilateral diplomacy with Turkey, Secretary Blinken was just there, along with a number of other senior State Department officials, all for exactly that reason. It's not just about Damascus, but it's about de-escalating the situation in Northeast. In that sense, Turkey is the big player and the sort of kingmaker and decider of all of this.
Ammar, do you have thoughts on the Turkish role?
I agree completely with what Charles is saying, and I will also emphasize the fact that Qatar is definitely going to emerge as a major player. They have financial clout, and they are going to use that to create a major foothold for themselves inside Syria. And the Saudis with the Emiratis will have to play catch up, basically, because of they really have not, they have been almost against this transition as a whole. So Qatar is probably the biggest beneficiary, even more than Turkey, in my opinion. But they have to work together with Turkey in order for them to be able to succeed. So, and the other thing we really need to realize about Turkey is that they have defeated Russia right now. What's that? 3-0 the score in Nagorno-Karabakh in Ukraine, and here basically they've really made a mark in this situation. But of course, something here about Russia to be said is that they might have gotten out of the door, but they might come back still through the window. They are holding talks with HTS and the leaders to see if they can keep their base going, especially in Khmeimim, and that can therefore keep their operations in Africa alive. If these talks fail, then Russia is in really deep trouble.
All right, so let's talk about the second player, the big loser, which is Iran. Syria. So for those who are not conversant in the Islamic politics of this, Iran is, of course, the leader of the Shia world. The Assad regime was its land bridge to Lebanon, where Hezbollah is its major proxy against the Israelis. That land bridge has now been severed and is in control of Sunni factions which are quite hostile to it, and Kurdish factions which are certainly not friendly either. So, Ammar, where do you see the Iranians? Do they have a play here? And if so, what does it look like?
I mean, the whole situation right now for Iran and Syria reminds me of Syria's situation in Lebanon when they had to pull out from Lebanon in 2005. One of the things I wrote about at the time was that now the battle will go to Damascus because Assad was getting a lot of legitimacy from being this sort of like an emperor. They have two countries under his control and, projecting strength. But once your size diminish and you're now back to your own territory, whatever problems that will happen there. You have to confront certain challenges at home. So now I think the main challenge for Tehran is the home front. What are they going to do? How are they going to justify these losses? How are they going to spend them? How are they going to appease the populations? There are economic ramifications, perhaps. So I think for Tehran, if they have to be inwardly focused right now, if they want to survive the next few years. And if they are going to try to keep sort of talking about the axis of resistance or try to revive it or sort of try to reinvest in it somehow, I think they will create an internal domestic backlash that's already happening anyway. So I think Tehran's problem is in Tehran right now, and they really have certain challenges that they need to confront internally, and they can no longer run away from them by hiding behind these foreign adventures.
Charles, what do you think? Does Iran have a short-term play in Syria, or is this now, retrenching to regime survival in Tehran?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically Ammar makes a really important point in that in implying the strategic significance of this loss. I mean, for Iran, for decades, Syria has been the jewel in the crown of its entire regional agenda. Without Syria, everything falls apart. It's not just the land bridge, but the air bridge too. I mean, Damascus International Airport in particular was literally the thoroughfare for weaponry and personnel and money and logistics for a very long time, and it's all gone. So there's no understating the strategic significance of that loss. I think we will see Iran double down its investment in Iraq, particularly with the already agreed US agreement to start transitioning at least some of our troops out of the country, transitioning down our mandate from the counter-ISIS coalition to just a bilateral security relationship. And I think the Iranians will see that as a huge opportunity to at least win over Iraq and seal up at least control there. And then perhaps the long-term plan will be to use that as a springboard to try and re-exert itself in Syria. But that's going to be a big ask if Syria can stabilize and can recover and can build the kind of transition that we're all kind of aspirationally talking about. If they don't, on the other hand, then Iran will have at least an opportunity to slowly find more covert ways of rooting themselves back in certain areas of Syria. But that will be an enormous challenge. I think the one thing that the Iranians had always counted on was the fact that at least part of the Syrian regime's security apparatus had an interest in working with the IRGC. What we saw, in the dramatic collapse of the regime over the past couple of weeks was that when push came to shove, there was almost zero loyalty to Assad in the end. I mean, the march from Aleppo to Damascus was, yes, in part driven by the fact that HTS in particular had built itself into a much more capable military actor over the last 4 or 5 years. But it was also because the regime,
the forces just melted.
Yeah, the regime just gave in. I mean, every single front line, there was negotiations to say, would you like a safe exit? Would you like to surrender, or would you like to defect to us? And 50% of the time, that's exactly what happened. Towns and cities fell without a fight. That would seem to suggest to me that Iran would have very few options in terms of local partners to revitalize those relationships. The only way that would change is if the absolute worst case scenario happens and Syria devolves into an absolutely terrible civil conflict. That would then reopen some of those doors. But hopefully we won't get there, and we're certainly not there now.
All right. Finally, there are the Israelis to the south, Scott. You and I have had about 100 conversations about Israeli strategic objectives in Lebanon and Syria and in the region more generally, but they've been super aggressive the last several days, destroyed the Syrian Navy, such as it was, hit a variety of targets recently, and occupied an additional spate of land on the north side of the Golan. What do you think the Israeli play is here? What are they trying to do? And how does it interact with the Syrian transition, however it forms itself?
It's a really good question, but I think it's worth seeing what the Israelis are doing now as part of a trajectory that it's been on really since October 7th attacks, and particularly since the relative success of the Lebanon offensive it launched just a few months ago this year. We've seen the Netanyahu government, the state of Israel generally, I don't think it's just limited to Netanyahu and his supporters, go on the offensive. They have decided that their regional security posture was inadequate and is inadequate, and they're taking dramatic steps to change that. Focused primarily on Gaza, where I think it's been a mixed bag at best, and probably worse than that. But nonetheless has at least disabled Hamas substantially from presenting a threat despite the massive humanitarian costs and potential destabilizing effect there. Then in the north now, you see this offensive against Lebanon that is has wound down at this point. Incredibly devastating to Hezbollah, always seen as the biggest conventional military threat to Israel, realistically in the near term, because of their substantial military capability, substantial armaments by Iran. The fact that you had veteran units that have been fighting in the Syrian civil war for years at this point get decimated, devastated, dramatically changing the whole power balance. And then most importantly, revealing that Iran was not willing or able to step in a meaningful way and provide any sort of defense. And I think that really opened the door to Israel to say, okay, well, we are now going to change our security posture. I don't think they had any idea that this would lead to the collapse of the Assad regime. I highly doubt that, at least not far enough advanced for it to fit into their strategic logic. But I think when they saw, like the Turks, when they saw it happening, that it was coming down, they saw moments of opportunity, and they're continuing to pursue their strategy, which is that they are, reactions in the region be damned, forcing conditions that improve their short to medium term security. And that means establishing an additional buffer zone around the original buffer zone of the Golan Heights. Now we've got a buffer for the buffer, incorporating Druze communities there that they do have cultural ties, well, residents of the Golan Heights have cultural ties to, that some affiliation with, past relationship with. But nonetheless, this idea that they are pushing further into Syria as a security buffer, and then hitting and diminishing and deteriorating the conventional military capabilities of whatever Syrian state comes next. So they're not in a position to threaten Israel. My suspicion is that this is a short-term, effort to change facts on the ground in Israel's favor. I don't think this military campaign is going to continue much longer, because I do think there is a risk that it is going to risk alienating and triggering imminent hostility with HTS, the sovereignty government, whatever comes next, because in the end, you're destroying equipment that belongs to the state that they believe they now lead. But in the short term, I think Israel sees that risk as worth it to make a couple of really, really substantial changes in the current facts on the ground in their favor. Then I suspect they'll ratchet back. I don't know what happens to the holding the territory in the south. I think that's going to become a longer term issue to some extent. And I'd actually be really curious to hear what Charles and Ammar have to say about that, because I don't know the dynamics around that strip of land and the communities there well enough. But other than that, I kind of think you will see Israel calm down what it's doing in the near term. But it's going to feel more secure, because it means that a conventional military threat from Syria is now several years off, because whatever new Syrian state comes out is going to have to rearm itself before it can even think about threatening Israel in any meaningful way.
Yeah, so let's hear from you both on the situation in the South before we wrap. Ammar, are people in other parts of Syria, is this just seen as background noise stuff that Israel does in the South, or is this seen as a real affront in this environment? What has been the reaction among Syrians to what the Israelis have done?
The strange thing about this is that there have been some voices uttered on social media and by some expats, basically, that this is wrong and should not happen, and some concerns by academics, especially on the left here, but the HTS government didn't say anything. In fact, they've ignored the issue altogether. And most Syrians that I've known, they really don't want to comment on that. There is a fear, perhaps, among some that this might indeed evolve into and draw a confrontation or a response from HTS, and everybody was happy that this did not take place. There is an understanding, albeit a bit cynical, that Israel is bombing equipment that might fall into the hand of radical groups. So why not let them not fall into the hand of radical groups? I think for now there is not much of a reaction, and I think people just want to forget that. And I think whatever HTS-led government or type government is going to emerge, prefer not to have that issue with Israel at all. In due course of time, years in the future, I think whatever territory that Israel took over right now will have to become subject to negotiations over finalizing our border with it, and therefore some kind of peace talks if we had a government pragmatic enough to do it. The people involved, the people in the territories that Israel took over, refused to leave. I mean, Israel wanted them to leave. HTS also told them you can leave. They don't want to leave because I think life under Israeli occupation for the Druze, for the Syrians in this particular area in the Golan, has not really been bad at all. The living conditions and the security have always been good, so they have no reason really to leave, and that's good. So in a sense, no one really has been harmed by these strikes that Israel has conducted over Syria. Perhaps the pride of some Syrians, but beyond that, there is really no strategic loss. We don't want to see a militarized Syrian state under radical control anyway. Most Syrians are probably not going to object to this.
Charles, you get the last word today.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I think everything Ammar said is right. I think that we've had a lot more noise from Syrian expats than we have from Syrians inside Syria around the strikes. For me, I think purely from Israel's self-interest, I understand the desire to take out heavy military equipment and air defenses and, sophisticated strategic missile systems. I get it. I think the land grab was opportunistic, illegal, to put it bluntly, and thus quite problematic. I think on the ground, HTS has been pragmatic enough to know that it's gained an enormous amount in 10 days and it doesn't have an interest in picking any more fights. And actually HTS did, Jolani himself issue a statement yesterday which didn't name Israel but was very clearly directed at Israel, and it suggested that it as HTS and the new Syria has no interest in any further hostilities with any external actors, and this was the time to sort of rebuild and reunify Syria. That was clearly, I think, the most diplomatic way to put what I understand the US has been messaging to the Israelis in recent days, which is, okay, we get it. You've done enough now, but back off. This is the time for calm. This is the time for de-escalation. And your actions are, okay, understandable. The rhetoric needs to cool it a little bit. And ultimately, behavior on the ground inside Syria is what matters. And we haven't seen a single indication of hostile intent from any of these actors. The armed groups in Deraa in the south were working, frankly, some of them with the Israelis in earlier years of the crisis. So, and
again, the Israelis were treating their wounded, actually.
Exactly.
There was a whole series of cross-border transfers of Deraa fighters. They would just leave them at the border, and the Israelis would treat them in Sfat. And it was presumably recruited a huge amount of intelligence capacity that way. So it wasn't like out of the goodness of the Israelis' heart, but there's a lot of cooperative relations across that border that are not. And I will also note that the statement that you just referred to is certainly the least belligerent statement ever issued by an al-Qaeda or former al-Qaeda faction about the state of Israel. And so there's like that feeds back into Ammar's earlier point about the extreme pragmatism with which al-Jolani is conducting himself up to and including in references to the state of Israel. So I do think there's a lot to be optimistic about in that, if very tentatively. We're going to leave it there. Charles Lister, Ammar Abdulhamid, Scott Anderson, So great of you all to join us, and let's do it again soon. I suspect this set of issues is not